Dad, we're about to sit down for dinner. Can this wait? My son said. Daniel, I just needed a minute, I replied. A minute turns into an hour with you. I have my own family to worry about. Before I could answer, the line went dead. I stared at my phone for several seconds, listening to the silence in my little Montana house. 10 minutes later, I received a text from my daughter Susan. Not a call, not even a question about how I was doing. Just one sentence. Sorry, Dad. Busy week. That was my 74th birthday. No cake, no visit, no family dinner. Just a disconnected phone call and a text message that looked like it had been written while standing in a grocery store checkout line. What hurt wasn't that they forgot the date. What hurt was realizing they probably remembered and simply didn't care. Then something happened 3 weeks later that made me question everything I thought I knew about my family. But before I tell you that story, if this story speaks to your heart, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if this story truly resonates with you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave your city or country and your local time in the comments below. I read as many comments as I can, and it always amazes me how people from all over the world come together through stories like this. My name is Richard Harper. I'm 74 years old, and what happened that autumn changed the future of my family forever. The lesson hidden inside this story took me a lifetime to understand, and if you stay until the end, you'll understand why. Now let me take you back to where it all began. I live outside Billings, Montana, in a small house that's seen better days. It's nothing special. 2 bedrooms, a creaky front porch, an old pickup truck parked beside a shed that should probably have been repaired years ago. After my wife Linda passed away 8 years earlier, the place got quieter every year. At first, the kids visited occasionally. Then holidays became phone calls. Phone calls became text messages. Text messages became long stretches of silence. I tried not to complain. Everybody has their own lives. That's what I told myself. Daniel lived in Dallas. Susan was in Phoenix. They both had careers, spouses, responsibilities. I understood that. At least I thought I did. Still, some days were harder than others. Especially birthdays. Especially holidays. Especially when I saw neighbors surrounded by children and grandchildren while my own dining room table stayed empty. The funny thing is that the only person who consistently called me wasn't one of my children. It was my grandson Ethan, 19 years old, college student, worked part-time delivering groceries, drove a beat-up Honda that sounded like it was negotiating with gravity every time it started. Yet somehow he always found time to call. Around 11 that night, after everyone else had forgotten my birthday, my phone rang. Grandpa, Ethan said. I almost missed it. Missed what? I asked. Your birthday. I laughed. Looks like you're the only one who remembered. There was a pause. They forgot. They're busy. That's not an answer. I looked out the kitchen window into the darkness. No, I guess they forgot. Ethan sighed. Happy birthday, Grandpa. We ended up talking for nearly 20 minutes. Classes, football, his terrible apartment, the rising price of gas. Nothing important. And somehow everything important. When I hung up, I felt a little less alone. I didn't know it then, but that phone call would eventually change both of our lives. The next morning started like any other. Coffee, newspaper, a quiet house. Then around 10:30, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Mr. Richard Harper? A professional voice asked. Speaking. My name is Rebecca Collins. I'm calling from Sheridan, Wyoming. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Walter Dawson. The name hit me like a memory I hadn't opened in years. Walter Dawson, a distant cousin I'd met only a handful of times growing up. I'm sorry, I said carefully. Representing his estate. Mr. Dawson passed away 6 days ago. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. I didn't know. There is a reason I am contacting you, Mr. Harper. Your name appears in documents we need to discuss. I looked around the empty kitchen. The coffee suddenly tasted cold. What kind of documents? There was a brief pause on the other end. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. I believe it would be better if we discussed that in person. And in that moment, sitting alone in my quiet Montana kitchen, I had absolutely no idea that a secret buried for decades was about to pull my entire family into a test none of them saw coming. For the rest of that day, I could not stop thinking about Walter Dawson. The truth was, he had never been an important figure in my life. At least not on the surface. I had probably seen him fewer than 10 times over 74 years. Yet somehow an attorney from Wyoming was calling me instead of any of the dozens of other relatives scattered across the country. It did not make sense. That night, I sat on my porch as the Montana sun disappeared behind the hills, and old memories started drifting back. The funny thing about growing older is that you start seeing patterns you missed when you were young. Looking back, I realized I had spent most of my life being the extra person in my own family. My younger brother, Thomas, was the golden child. He was smarter, according to my father, more ambitious, according to my mother, better at sports, better with people, better at everything. At least that was the story I heard growing up. I remember one Christmas when I was 12. My father handed Thomas a brand new bicycle with shiny chrome handlebars. I got a used toolbox from a garage sale. I still remember forcing a smile. My mother looked at me and said, "Richard, you should be grateful. Tools build character." Then she spent the next 20 minutes taking photographs of Thomas riding his new bike down the driveway. Nobody took a picture of me. Small things like that add up over time. At 14, I spent an entire summer helping my father repair fences on a neighboring ranch. Every morning I was outside before sunrise. Every evening I came home covered in dust. At the end of the summer, my father handed Thomas $200. "For working so hard," he said. I looked at him and laughed because I thought he was joking. He was not. "What about me?" I asked. My father barely looked up from his newspaper. "You were supposed to help. Thomas needed the money more." I wanted to argue, but I already knew how that conversation would end. Years later, when Linda and I got married, the same pattern continued. Thomas received help with a down payment on his first house. Linda and I rented a small apartment and figured things out ourselves. When Daniel was born, my parents drove 3 hours to visit. When Susan was born, they sent a card. Somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting much from anybody. That sounds sad when I say it out loud, but it is true. You learn to live with disappointment the same way you learn to live with an old knee injury. Some days you barely notice it. Other days it reminds you it is still there. That was one reason Ethan stood out. He never treated me like an obligation. He asked questions. He listened. He remembered things. Most people do not realize how rare that becomes when you get older. 3 days after the attorney called, I found an old photograph buried inside a drawer. It showed me, maybe 16 years old, standing beside Walter at a county fair in Wyoming. I stared at the picture for a long time. Then I flipped it over. Written on the back, in faded blue ink, were 7 words that made my heart skip a beat. "One day, you will understand why." I sat at my kitchen table for nearly an hour staring at those 7 words. One day, you will understand why. The handwriting was definitely Walter's. I remembered it from old Christmas cards and the occasional letter he sent decades ago. What I did not understand was why he had written it on the back of a photograph of the two of us. I turned the picture over again. Walter looked exactly as I remembered him. Tall, lean, quiet. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke. Growing up, he was one of the few adults who never compared me to my brother. Back then, I never realized how unusual that was. 2 days later, I made the drive to Sheridan, Wyoming. The trip was a little over 300 miles from my place. Long enough to think. Long enough to remember things I had not thought about in years. Rebecca Collins met me at her office just after lunch. She was probably in her early 50s, organized, professional, and surprisingly warm. She shook my hand and said, "Mr. Harper, thank you for coming." "You have me curious," I said. "That makes 2 of us." She smiled slightly and opened a file folder thicker than I expected. For the next hour she asked questions. Family history, childhood memories, my relationship with Walter. At one point I finally interrupted her. "With all due respect, why are we talking about my life?" She folded her hands. "Because Walter spent years documenting it." I thought I had heard her wrong. Documenting it? Yes. She opened another folder and slid several pages across the desk. My name appeared repeatedly. Dates, notes, observations. Some were more than 40 years old. I felt a chill run through me. "Why would he do that?" I asked. "That is something I believe you will soon understand." On the drive home, my phone rang. It was Daniel. That alone surprised me. We sometimes went weeks without speaking. "Dad, Daniel, Susan told me you were in Wyoming." I frowned. "How does Susan know that?" "You posted a picture of the highway on social media." I did not realize anybody paid attention. There was an awkward pause. "What were you doing out there?" Normally, I would have brushed the question aside. Normally, I would have laughed and changed the subject. That had been my habit for decades. Keep the peace. Avoid tension. Make everyone comfortable. But for some reason, I did not do that this time. Why do you ask? I said. Another pause. Longer now. Just curious. Interesting. You have not been curious about my life in quite a while. Silence. I had never spoken to him that way before. Not once. Finally, he cleared his throat. I have to go. Talk later. The call ended. I stared at the dashboard for several seconds. Something felt different. Small. Almost invisible. But different. For the first time in years, I had not rushed to smooth things over. I had not apologized for existing. When I got home, I found another voicemail waiting. This one from Susan. Dad, call me when you get a chance. I wanted to ask you something. Then an hour later, another message arrived. This time from Melissa, my daughter-in-law. Melissa never called me directly. Ever. Richard, give me a call when you can. I stood in my kitchen looking at the phone. 3 calls in one day. After months of barely hearing from any of them. It could have been coincidence. Maybe it was. But deep down, I had the uncomfortable feeling that something had shifted. And whatever it was, I was beginning to suspect my family knew more than they were letting on. Then the next morning, Rebecca Collins called again. The first thing she said was, Mr. Harper, there is something important I forgot to tell you during our meeting. The tone of her voice made me sit down immediately. What is it? I asked. Her answer changed the entire direction of my thinking. And before she finished the sentence, I realized that Walter had been keeping a secret for much longer than anyone imagined. Mr. Harper, Walter did not start documenting your life 40 years ago, Rebecca said. He started almost 60 years ago. I felt my grip tighten around the phone. 60 years. The earliest records we found go back to when you were a teenager. I looked out the kitchen window at the empty yard. Nothing about that sentence made sense. Why would anyone do that? I asked. Because he believed something was happening that nobody else seemed willing to acknowledge. I did not answer. Rebecca continued. Walter kept journals. Hundreds of pages. Letters. Notes. Financial records. Personal observations. He was convinced that certain members of your family were not treating you fairly. For a moment, I honestly thought she was exaggerating. Then she said something that stopped me cold. He wrote that every time he visited family gatherings, he watched the same pattern repeat itself. I sat back in my chair. Walter had seen it too. The birthdays. The comparisons. The excuses. The way my accomplishments somehow became invisible while everyone else's were celebrated. There is more, Rebecca said carefully. A lot more. Before I could ask another question, my phone beeped. Incoming call. Susan. I ignored it. A second later, another call appeared. Daniel. Then a text message. Then another. By lunchtime, I had received 6 messages from family members who usually took weeks to return a simple call. Something was wrong. Or maybe something had finally become visible. Around 3 that afternoon, I called Susan back. Dad, she answered immediately. There you are. What is going on? I asked. What do you mean? You called twice. Daniel called twice. Melissa left messages. Suddenly, everyone wants to talk. There was a brief silence. We are worried about you. The answer felt rehearsed. Since when? Another pause. Dad, that is not fair. Maybe not. Daniel said you have been making trips out of state. There it was. The first clue. Daniel said that? He mentioned it. Interesting. Susan lowered her voice. Dad, is everything okay financially? The question surprised me. Why would you ask that? No reason. But it sounded like a reason. A very specific reason. That evening Daniel finally called. His tone was completely different from the conversation we had a few days earlier. Friendly. Curious. Almost eager. How are you doing? He asked. Fine. Need anything? I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was strange. Very strange. That is generous of you. Well, you are my father. I heard Melissa speaking in the background. A few muffled words. Then Daniel said, Have you talked to any lawyers recently? My stomach dropped. There it was. Not concern. Not family. Not love. Information. Somebody knew something. Or thought they did. Why would you ask that? I said. Just making conversation. The call ended a few minutes later, but the feeling stayed with me. The next morning things became even stranger. A cousin I had not spoken to in 12 years sent me a friend request online. An aunt from Colorado suddenly left a voicemail. A nephew I barely remembered texted, Hope you are doing well, Uncle Rick. It was as if an invisible rumor had started moving through the family tree. Nobody was saying anything directly, Nobody was asking the real question, but they were all circling something, watching, waiting. Then late that afternoon, Rebecca sent me scanned copies from Walter's journals. I opened the first file. The date at the top was nearly 20 years old. Halfway down the page, one sentence jumped out immediately. If the truth ever comes out, they will all pretend they cared. I felt a chill move through my chest, because at that exact moment, my phone started ringing again. And when I looked at the screen, I saw nearly every member of my family trying to reach me at once. Over the next week, the calls did not stop. At first, I thought it would pass. Families go through strange phases. People hear rumors. Curiosity takes over. But this felt different. It felt organized without anyone admitting it was organized. Every morning, I woke up to missed calls. Every afternoon brought new messages. Every evening ended with another attempt from someone who had not shown much interest in my life for years. Susan sent 3 emails in 2 days. The first one asked if I wanted to visit Phoenix for Thanksgiving. The second included photographs of the grandchildren. The third simply said, "Dad, I feel like we have not been close lately." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Not because it was wrong, because it ignored how we got there. Daniel started calling every evening around 6. "Just checking in," he would say, "making sure you were doing okay." One night he added, "You know, maybe we should spend more time together." "Maybe," I replied. "We have been saying that for 10 years. He laughed awkwardly. "Well, it is never too late." A few days later, Melissa mailed me a handwritten card. That alone nearly made me drop it. In 25 years, I could not remember receiving a handwritten note from her. Inside, she wrote 3 paragraphs about family, memories, and staying connected. She even included photographs from an old barbecue at their house. Looking at the pictures, I noticed something strange. I was standing at the edge of every frame, never in the center, never beside anyone, just present enough to prove I had attended. The card ended with, "We love you and miss you." I set it on the table and felt absolutely nothing. Not anger, not happiness, just exhaustion. Around the same time, distant relatives started appearing. A cousin from Nebraska sent a Christmas card in October. An aunt from Colorado suddenly wanted to schedule weekly phone calls. A nephew invited me to a fishing trip despite not contacting me in almost 8 years. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Everyone was trying. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was reaching out. Yet somehow none of it felt real. One evening Ethan called while I was sorting through more of Walter's journals. "Grandpa, you sound tired." "Do I?" "Yeah." I hesitated. Then I told him about the calls, the messages, the sudden attention. Ethan listened quietly. Finally he asked, "Do you think they actually care?" The question hung in the air between us. "I do not know," I admitted. "Maybe they do. And maybe they think something is coming." I looked at the stack of journals beside me. "Maybe." "What does your gut say?" he asked. Nobody else ever asked me questions like that. My gut, my thoughts, my feelings. They mostly asked for information. Ethan asked for truth. "My gut says people rarely change overnight," I said. "Then trust your gut." After we hung up, I opened another journal. Inside was a note Walter had written years earlier. It described a family reunion I barely remembered. He listed conversations, observations, even seating arrangements. One sentence caught my attention immediately. "They only notice Richard when they need something from him." I closed the journal and sat in silence. The hardest part was not realizing people had disappointed me. The hardest part was realizing how long I had spent making excuses for them. By the end of that week, the calls became less frequent. The emails slowed down. The sudden concern began fading. One by one, people returned to their lives. It was as if they had reached for something, failed to find it, and quietly stepped back. And when the noise finally disappeared, I found myself sitting alone in my kitchen again, surrounded by unanswered questions, an old photograph, a stack of journals, and a silence that somehow felt heavier than before. The following month was the loneliest I had experienced since Linda passed away. That surprised me because I had already spent 8 years learning how to live alone. I knew how to cook for one person. I knew how to sit through quiet evenings. I knew how to wake up in an empty house. But there is a difference between being alone and realizing how few people would notice if you disappeared for a while. One cold morning, I found one of Linda's old coffee mugs in the back of a cabinet. A simple white mug with a faded blue flower painted on the side. I stood there holding it longer than I should have. "You would know what to do," I said quietly to the empty kitchen. For a second, I almost expected an answer. Instead, there was only the sound of the refrigerator humming in the corner. A few days later, I drove to the cemetery. I had not visited in months. The grass was trimmed. The headstone looked exactly the same as always. I sat in the folding chair I kept in my truck and talked to her the way I used to. Things are getting strange, Linda. I laughed softly. Actually, they have probably been strange for a long time. I am just finally seeing it. That was the realization that kept returning. Not anger. Not bitterness. Clarity. For years I had explained away every disappointment. Everybody is busy. Everybody has problems. Everybody forgets sometimes. But sitting there beside Linda's grave, I finally admitted something I had avoided for decades. Relationships cannot survive on excuses alone. They need effort. And effort had been coming from only one direction for a very long time. When I got home, I found a voicemail from Daniel. Dad, call me back when you can. Nothing urgent. Nothing specific. Just another message. I listened to it twice before deleting it. Not because I was angry. Because I was tired. Tired of conversations that never seemed to go anywhere. Tired of pretending things were fine when they were not. That evening Ethan called. How was your day? He asked. Nobody else ever started conversations that way. I visited your grandmother. I miss her too, he said. We sat in silence for a few seconds. Then Ethan said something that stayed with me. You know, Grandpa, sometimes people get so used to having someone around that they stop noticing how much that person matters. I stared out the window at the darkening Montana sky. That is a pretty wise thing for a 19-year-old to say. He laughed. Do not tell anybody. I have a reputation to protect. For the first time in weeks, I genuinely smiled. After we hung up, I opened another one of Walter's journals. This one was newer than the others. Near the end, I found a folded piece of paper tucked between two pages. It was not part of the journal. It was a separate note addressed directly to me. My name was written across the front. My hands actually trembled a little as I unfolded it. The message itself was short, very short, but by the time I finished reading it, I realized Walter had anticipated everything that was happening. Every phone call, every sudden display of concern, every doubt. And at the bottom of the note was a single instruction that marked the beginning of something entirely different. It said, before you make any decisions, you must learn who truly shows up when there is nothing to gain. I read Walter's note 3 times that night. The words were simple, but they stayed with me. Before you make any decisions, you must learn who truly shows up when there is nothing to gain. The next morning, instead of sitting around thinking about it, I got up before sunrise and drove into town. For years my life had become smaller without me noticing. After Linda passed away, I stopped saying yes to things. I stopped going places. I stopped building anything new. Somewhere along the way, I had started waiting instead of living. That morning, I decided to change that. The first thing I did was visit the community workshop on the edge of Billings. It was an old metal building where retired mechanics, carpenters, and ranch hands volunteered a few days each week teaching practical skills to younger people. I had repaired engines most of my life. There was no reason I could not still be useful. The manager, a man named Carl, looked surprised when I walked in. Richard Harper, he said. I have not seen you in years. I was starting to think that might be the problem, I replied. Carl laughed. You looking for work? Not exactly. Then what are you looking for? I glanced around the shop. Teenagers were learning how to rebuild small engines. A young woman was repairing a lawn tractor. Somebody was welding in the corner. For the first time in a long while, the place felt alive. Maybe I am looking for a reason to get out of the house. Carl smiled. Well, you came to the right place. Within 2 weeks, I was volunteering 3 mornings a week. Nothing dramatic happened. No grand speeches. No life-changing moments. Just work. Honest work. A teenager would bring me a broken carburetor. I would show him how to fix it. Somebody would ask a question. I would answer it. Little by little, my days started feeling fuller. One afternoon, Ethan called while I was driving home. Where are you? He asked. Community workshop. Again. You sound happier. I thought about that for a second. Maybe I am. Good. That was Ethan. No lecture. No analysis. Just good. A few days later, Carl stopped me as I was leaving. You know, he said, the kids really like you. I laughed. They like the free advice. No, he said. They like being listened to. That stayed with me all the way home. Being listened to. Such a simple thing. Yet so many people go years without it. As autumn turned colder, I noticed something else changing. I stopped checking my phone every hour. I stopped wondering who might call. I stopped measuring my worth by other people's attention. My life was not becoming bigger because somebody finally noticed me. It was becoming bigger because I had finally started noticing myself. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Rebecca Collins called again. Her voice sounded different this time. More certain. "Mr. Harper," she said, "the estate review is almost complete." I sat down immediately. What does that mean? It means we finally have answers. I looked out the window as rain tapped softly against the glass. For months, I had been following clues, reading journals, and uncovering pieces of a story I never knew existed. Now it sounded like the final piece was about to arrive. And based on Rebecca's tone, whatever she was about to reveal was far bigger than I had imagined. 2 days later, I was sitting across from Rebecca Collins in her office in Sheridan again. The rain had cleared, and the Wyoming sky stretched for miles outside the window. Rebecca placed a thick binder on the table between us. This time there was no mystery in her expression. No hesitation. "Richard," she said, "I think Walter spent most of his adult life preparing for this conversation." I looked at the binder. My name was printed neatly across the front. That is a lot of paperwork. That is a lot of history. For the next several hours, she walked me through documents, letters, records, and notes. Walter had not simply observed my life. He had followed it with remarkable attention. He knew when Linda and I bought our first house. He knew when Daniel was born. He knew when Susan graduated high school. He knew when I lost my job during a downer 30 years earlier and took temporary work just to keep food on the table. "Why?" I asked again. Rebecca smiled softly. "Because he admired you." Nobody had ever used that word before. Admired. I sat there quietly. "Walter believed character mattered more than success," she continued. "And in his notes, he repeatedly described you as the most dependable person in the family." I did not know what to say. At 74 years old, praise felt strangely unfamiliar. The following week brought another unexpected change. Carl called me into his office at the workshop. "Close the door," he said. "You are making me nervous already." He laughed and slid a small plaque across the desk. My name was engraved on it. Richard Harper, Senior Mentor. "What is this?" I asked. "The board approved it yesterday." "Approved what?" "You." I stared at the plaque. "You have become the reason half these kids show up on time." That sounds unlikely. It happens to be true. Later that afternoon, Carl handed me a dark blue work shirt with my name stitched above the pocket. The workshop logo sat on the sleeve. It was a simple thing, just fabric and thread. But when I put it on, I felt something I had not felt in years. Useful. Not because somebody gave me a title, because I had earned one. A few days later, one of the younger students stopped me beside a workbench. "Mr. Harper?" "Yeah." "I got the engine running." "You did?" His face lit up. "First try." I walked over and listened to the engine idle smoothly. "Sounds pretty good. You taught me that." I shook my head. "No. I showed you where to start. You did the work." Driving home that evening, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The blue work shirt was still on. My name stitched clearly across the chest. For most of my life, I had measured myself through other people's approval, through family expectations, through comparisons I never asked for. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that identity is built through actions, not opinions. That realization felt bigger than any inheritance or family secret. Then, as if the universe wanted to remind me the story was not finished yet, my phone rang. "Ethan." "Grandpa, guess what?" "What?" "I got a weekend off." "Congratulations." "I was thinking about driving up to see you." I smiled immediately. "You are always welcome." After we hung up, I sat quietly in my truck for a moment. The present finally felt stable. The loneliness had begun to loosen its grip. The confusion was slowly turning into understanding. And yet, underneath all of it, one fact remained unchanged. Walter's estate review was complete. The answers were waiting. The only thing left was to hear them. And as I pulled into my driveway that evening, I had a feeling the next conversation was going to change everything. The following Saturday, Ethan arrived just after noon. I heard his old Honda before I saw it. The engine still had that uneven sound I remembered from our phone calls. When he stepped out, he looked tired from the drive, but happy to be there. "You made good time," I said. "Only stopped twice." He smiled and grabbed his backpack from the passenger seat. "I figured I should see my favorite grandfather." "Your only grandfather." "Details." We spent the afternoon the way we usually did. Coffee on the porch. A walk around town. Dinner at a small diner where the waitress knew my name. Nothing extraordinary. That was the point. For the first time in months, everything felt simple. The next morning, however, reality returned. Rebecca had arranged a final meeting at her office in Sheridan. Ethan offered to drive. The trip felt different from my previous visits. Not because the road had changed. Because I had changed. Months earlier I had arrived confused, uncertain, and looking for answers. Now I was calm. Whatever happened next, I no longer felt like a man waiting for somebody else to define his value. Halfway through the drive, Ethan glanced over. You seem surprisingly relaxed. Do I? Honestly, yes. I looked out at the Wyoming landscape rolling past the window. I spent most of my life trying to understand why certain things happened. And sometimes understanding is less important than accepting reality. Ethan nodded slowly. That sounds like something Walter would write. I laughed. You never even met him. Maybe not. But after everything you told me, I think I would have liked him. We reached Sheridan just before 10. Rebecca was waiting when we arrived. She greeted Ethan warmly and led us into a conference room I had not seen before. The room was larger than her office. A long table occupied the center. Several folders were neatly arranged at one end. A pitcher of water sat beside a stack of glasses. Nothing dramatic. Yet the atmosphere felt unusually heavy. Is something wrong? I asked. Rebecca exchanged a glance with another man standing near the window. He introduced himself as an estate representative. Nothing is wrong, Rebecca said carefully. Today is simply the final stage. I noticed there were more chairs than necessary. Far more. Are we expecting other people? I asked. Rebecca hesitated for just a moment. Yes. Before she could say anything else, the conference room door opened. Daniel walked in first. Behind him came Melissa. A few seconds later, Susan entered with Greg. I stopped moving. Ethan looked just as surprised. Nobody had mentioned this. Nobody had warned me. For several seconds, the room remained completely silent. Daniel cleared his throat. Dad. Susan offered an awkward smile. Hi. I slowly turned toward Rebecca. What is this? Rebecca remained calm. Everyone named in the final review was invited. Nobody sat down immediately. Nobody seemed quite sure what to say. The tension felt almost physical. Then I noticed something else. On the table directly in front of Rebecca sat a sealed envelope. Thick. Official. My name printed across the front in Walter's unmistakable handwriting. Rebecca placed one hand gently on top of it and looked around the room. Before we begin, she said, there is something all of you need to hear. Rebecca opened the envelope carefully and removed several pages. The room became so quiet that I could hear the air conditioner running somewhere above us. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Walter's words were read exactly as he had written them. The first page contained personal instructions. The second outlined decisions that had already been finalized. The third explained why. Walter believed transparency would prevent misunderstandings, Rebecca said. He wanted every interested party present when these documents were presented. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Susan folded her hands together. Ethan sat beside me without saying a word. Rebecca continued reading. Walter had spent years evaluating the future of everything he owned. Not just assets, responsibilities, land, businesses, long-term plans. He had chosen successors based on trust, judgment, and character. Not age, not status, not family position. Character. That word seemed to hang in the room. Then Rebecca set down the papers and slid a large folder toward me. Richard, these are now yours to review. I opened it slowly. Inside were maps, operating reports, legal summaries, and photographs. Hundreds of pages. More than I could absorb in one sitting. This is extensive, I said quietly. Very, Rebecca replied. Daniel finally spoke. What exactly are we talking about? Rebecca looked at him calmly. A substantial estate. How substantial? Melissa asked. Rebecca did not answer immediately. Instead, she handed everyone a summary sheet. The reaction was immediate. Eyes widened. Faces changed. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Greg looked down at the page again as if he thought he had misread it. Susan inhaled sharply. Daniel simply stared. The numbers were impossible to ignore. For the first time since entering the room, nobody seemed interested in asking me casual questions. Nobody seemed interested in pretending this was an ordinary family gathering. Reality had entered the room. Ethan glanced at me instead of the paperwork. Grandpa, he said quietly, You okay? I nodded. I think so. Rebecca smiled faintly. That was actually Walter's final concern. Daniel looked up. What does that mean? Rebecca turned another page. Walter specifically instructed us to evaluate whether Richard felt prepared to assume control and leadership responsibilities connected to the estate. Daniel blinked. Leadership responsibilities? Yes. Rebecca folded her hands. This was never simply about property. The room became silent again. Then Carl's voice suddenly echoed in my memory. They like being listened to. Useful. Dependable. The words felt different now. Not because somebody had handed me authority. Because I finally understood why Walter had paid attention all those years. He had not been watching for success. He had been watching for consistency. Susan looked directly at me. Dad, did you know any of this? No, none of it. Not until recently. For the first time, nobody questioned my answer. Nobody corrected me. Nobody explained my own life back to me. They simply listened. It was a strange feeling. Then Rebecca opened the final section of the file. There is one last matter. The tone of her voice changed the atmosphere immediately. Even Ethan sat up straighter. Rebecca removed a separate document from the folder. It carried additional signatures and a different seal. Walter left specific instructions regarding future succession, she said. Those instructions name an individual. Daniel slowly leaned forward. Susan looked at the document. Melissa stopped moving entirely. I felt my heartbeat quicken as Rebecca looked around the room and prepared to read the final name aloud. Rebecca lowered her eyes to the document and began reading. The instructions were remarkably specific. Years earlier, Walter had established a succession framework for the estate. Independent advisors, attorneys, financial managers, and ranch operators had all participated in creating it. The process was not based on inheritance traditions. It was based on stewardship. According to the document, the person chosen to eventually inherit operational control after my lifetime would be determined by demonstrated character, personal responsibility, and commitment to family values. Walter had documented his reasoning in detail. Every requirement had been reviewed and legally recorded. Nothing had been decided impulsively. Nothing had appeared out of nowhere. Then Rebecca read the name. Ethan Harper. The room became perfectly still. Ethan looked genuinely confused. Me? Rebecca nodded. Yes. Ethan immediately turned toward me. Grandpa, I did not know anything about this. I know, I said. And I did. The surprise on his face was impossible to fake. Rebecca continued. Walter personally added an explanatory statement. She opened another page. He wrote that true character reveals itself when there is no audience, no reward, and no expectation of recognition. Nobody interrupted. He believed Ethan demonstrated those qualities repeatedly. Ethan stared at the table. Susan looked overwhelmed. Greg removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Daniel remained motionless. The silence lasted several seconds. Finally, Melissa spoke. So all of this has already been decided? Rebecca answered calmly. The legal framework was completed years ago. Without consulting the family? Melissa asked. Walter consulted the people responsible for administering the estate. Her answer was polite but firm. Daniel finally looked at me. Dad, there was something different in his voice now. Not anger. Not frustration. Something closer to uncertainty. Did you know Ethan was named? Not until today. You never discussed it? No, Ethan shook his head immediately. I had absolutely no idea. Again, nobody challenged him because the truth was obvious. The conversation that followed remained surprisingly calm. Perhaps everyone understood that arguments would change nothing. Perhaps the paperwork sitting on the table made reality impossible to avoid. Susan spoke softly. Dad, I feel like there are things we should probably talk about. I looked at her for a moment before answering. There probably are. Can we? She asked. Eventually. That was the first boundary I had ever established without apologizing for it. Eventually. Not immediately. Not because someone suddenly wanted access to me. Not because circumstances had changed. Because I would decide when I was ready. Daniel nodded slowly. That is fair. Another boundary followed naturally. I want everyone to understand something, I said. This is not about punishment. The room remained quiet. I am not interested in settling scores. I am not interested in making anyone feel bad. But I am also no longer interested in pretending certain realities did not exist. Nobody argued. Nobody tried to explain anything away. That alone felt significant. Ethan looked uncomfortable with all the attention. Honestly, I do not even know what to say. I smiled. You do not have to say anything. Rebecca gathered several documents and handed them to me. There will be meetings, reviews, and planning sessions over the coming months. I understand. As people slowly began standing, conversations started in small groups. Polite, careful, measured, yet beneath every word, I could feel something unresolved lingering in the room. The legal questions had been answered. The financial questions had been answered. But families are rarely transformed by paperwork alone. As we prepared to leave, Susan quietly touched my arm. Dad, yes. Her eyes filled with emotion she seemed unable to fully express. I hope this is not the end. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. I honestly do not know what comes next. And for the first time all day, nobody in the room seemed to know the answer either. The months that followed were quieter than I expected. Not perfect. Not dramatic. Just honest. The meetings continued. The paperwork continued. The responsibilities grew larger. I spent time learning things I never imagined I would be learning at 74 years old. Ranch operations, long-term planning, land management, investment reports. Some days were exhausting. Some days were rewarding. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was walking towards something instead of waiting for something. Ethan visited often. Sometimes he came for a weekend. Sometimes longer. We spent hours talking about the future. Not because he was trying to impress anyone. Not because he expected anything. He simply cared. One afternoon we stood on a ridge overlooking miles of open land while the wind moved through the grass. It is strange, Ethan said. What is? How one decision can change everything. I looked across the horizon. Usually it is not one decision. No. Usually it is 100 small decisions that nobody notices until years later. He thought about that for a moment and nodded. Over time, my relationship with Daniel and Susan slowly changed as well. Not overnight. Not magically. Trust does not work that way. There were conversations. Difficult ones. Honest ones. Sometimes uncomfortable ones. We stopped pretending certain things had never happened. We stopped hiding behind polite phrases. And surprisingly, that honesty created more peace than avoidance ever had. Some wounds healed. Some scars remained. That is life. The difference was that I no longer felt responsible for carrying everything alone. I learned something important through all of this. Boundaries are not punishment. They are not revenge. They are not walls designed to keep people out. Boundaries are simply a way of teaching people where your dignity lives. For years I thought love meant endless patience, endless sacrifice, endless understanding. What I finally learned is that healthy love also requires self-respect. If you allow others to define your value, eventually you forget how to define it yourself. And if there is one lesson this journey gave me, it is that your worth does not decrease simply because someone fails to recognize it. Sometimes the people closest to you are too distracted, too wounded, or too limited to see who you truly are. That does not make their judgment correct. It only makes it incomplete. If you are listening to this right now and you feel overlooked, forgotten, or taken for granted, I want you to hear something from an old man who learned it much later than he should have. Do not abandon yourself while waiting for someone else to appreciate you. Protect your peace. Protect your finances. Protect your emotional well-being. Be generous, but do not give away your identity. Be kind, but do not confuse kindness with surrender. And most importantly, do not let another person's opinion become the foundation of your self-worth. Looking back now, I believe God was working through circumstances I could not understand at the time. What felt like loss was often redirection. What felt like rejection was sometimes protection. And what felt like an ending became the beginning of a life I never expected to find. Today, the old white coffee mug with the faded blue flowers still sits in my kitchen. Beside it is the photograph of Walter and me from decades ago. The one with 7 words written on the back. Every morning when I make coffee, I see both of them sitting there together. One reminds me where I came from. The other reminds me what I finally learned. My name is Richard Harper. I am 74 years old. And the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let other people decide how much you are worth. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for allowing this old story to become part of your day. If something in this journey connected with your own life, then maybe neither of us is as alone as we once thought. And if you would like to share your thoughts, your experiences, or where you are watching from, I would love to read your comment. If this story meant something to you, consider sharing it with someone who may need the reminder. And if you enjoy stories about family, resilience, and second chances, I hope you will subscribe and join us again. There are many more stories waiting in this playlist. Some will make you reflect, some may surprise you, and some might remind you of moments from your own life that you have not thought about in years. Whenever you are ready, I will see you in the next story. Until then, take care of yourself, trust what your heart already knows, and remember that the people who truly matter are the ones who show up when there is nothing to gain.